Our customers are essentially coming to us and saying, Elan, we need you to test more than what you offer because we don't want to use the big labs.
This is our humble hemp patch.
5,000 years of medical cannabis use.
We're learning about other cannabinoids.
Marijuana is grown in every state in the Union.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. Alchemist Labs is one of the last independent analytical labs in the country. They've been doing plant identification and chemical analysis on supplements and herbs since the 1990s. It was started by Sydney Sudberg, but today we talk with his son Elan, who is now the CEO. Elan's background is microscopy, and so you'll get to hear him talk about his love of microscopes and their powers of identification. Every analytical lab has a different focus and a different set of strong skills. Elan proudly states that at Alchemist, they focus on plants and supplements. Today, Elan talks about how the company was founded, his herbal upbringing, and then he fills us in on the science and the culture around natural product testing. Here's Elan. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today with Elans Sudberg, who runs Alchemist Labs. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's wonderful.
One thing that intrigued as I was reading about your company, you were saying how the lab was founded accidentally. So can you tell me a little bit more about how the company started?
Yeah, so Alchemist Labs was actually started about 23 years ago, kind of by default. We were originally a tincture manufacturer run by my father, who was at the time a chiropractor and acupuncturist and had a line of herbal tinctures for his patients. I grew up with our house in the garage. There was a bunch of herbs and hydraulic presses and amber bottles full of all sorts of secret potions. And as I got older and needed some money, my dad put me to work, and I was pressing herbs and grinding herbs. Fast forward to about 1997, and there was some sort of issue in the dietary supplement industry where the FDA woke up and said, let's allow you to self-regulate or else we're going to do it ourselves. My father took some of the classes at the FDA, came back, and we did some self-regulation. We quickly started failing some materials, and the vendors whose material we failed were a little bit upset, but also perplexed, asked us to test again. We did so. They asked us to test again. We did so, and suddenly we were kind of a testing lab without realizing we were a testing lab. We switched gears around 98 to essentially open a testing lab for the dietary supplement industry. Back in that time, there were a few labs that existed, but they did a lot of other tests. In fact, every test, and they used a lot of the higher end, sexier equipment. We focused on plant identity, which was HTPLC and botanical microscopy, and sat there for about 10 years until the regs, which were the GMPs, good manufacturing practices, came out about 10 years later in around 2007. And we were essentially the right lab at the right time, in the right place, to be experts in plant identity, and it put us on the map. So fast forward to current time, and we test over or close to 2,000 different plant species. We do identity testing on those, and then we'll also tell you the phytochemical profile, constituent levels of those plants. And then lastly, we confirm that those ingredients are in finished products.
So out of all those 2,000 plants you test, are there any that are particularly tricky?
Yeah, it depends on the time, what's hot in the industry. We see a lot of challenges with some of the superfruits in recent times where it's a species of vaccinium. Most of those are brought to us from South America, and you can imagine shipping sticky berries is challenging. So essentially what they do is they juice them, they dry them, they send them to us. But unfortunately, a lot of them are mixed with other closely related species, and those have been challenging in recent times. We also see a lot of material that's dilute, and it begs the question, what really is identity testing? What makes a peach? And someone could argue that it's essentially a genetic profile. We argue that it's a phytochemical profile. As you know, in the cannabis industry, such can be dramatically changed by the growing, harvesting, drying. All those conditions will change the ultimate product. So we have in our lab a herbarium that houses almost 20,000 specimens that have been verified internally. So when we test an incoming material, we test it against many, many, many specimens, in some cases thousands of data points, to know exactly if it is or is not what you think it is. The industry is fast moving, and what's hot shows up in the industry, and then the adulterants follow. So keeping track of what common adulterants are is also a great challenge for our lab.
That must be a little bit disheartening as well to see those creeping into the supply chain.
It absolutely is, and it's why going to a lab that specializes in plant identity testing is the key. There are a lot of labs that exist in this industry. They test everything from pork and tilapia to aerospace technology, parts, oil, gas, pharmaceuticals, and plants. We've just focused on plant identity for all these years, which makes us experts in the field, which is why all the other labs either want to buy us or crush us.
You are a little bit of a David among a bunch of Goliaths. There aren't many solid small labs left in the United States anymore.
Absolutely. And it's funny because my last name is Sudberg, which is shortened from Sudberger, which originally meant South Mountain sheep herder. And if you recall the story, David was in fact a sheep herder. So I do have the David complex. I am, at least it feels that way, under attack by Goliath every day, all day. But we know how that story ended. So I'll leave it at that.
Well said. And so was it this early interest in working here that made you go to Cal State and get a chemistry degree?
We started the lab at 97. My original major was botany. I realized that I wanted to be able to afford to buy a home in Orange County, and botany careers aren't generally the best paying. I switched to business and then really realized that in order to run a lab, I needed a chemistry background. So I switched to chemistry. The lab was in Costa Mesa in the back room of my father's clinic when he was still practicing. So I needed to stay local because of the proximity to the lab, which was growing, and Cal State Long Beach was the best choice for me. We actually lived in Long Beach, which was an easy choice.
So how did it help to have this chemistry degree as you came in and took Alchemist to the next level?
It was a good fit. I figured that I needed to understand chemistry from a foundational standpoint to run a laboratory. I had actually never intended to be a working chemist in my own company, rather just to manage smart people. At that time, I actually had an advanced organic chemistry class where the TA was an employee of mine. So he and I would meet at class. He would help me set up my lab quickly so that I can get out quickly so that he and I can race back to the lab so I can be his boss. That was how I ended up finishing school and eventually hired as many friends and family as I possibly could, even hairdresser's neighbor who actually currently works for us to date.
That's great. It does sound like you have a small kind of feel there of trying to be in touch with your customers and in touch with the industry.
Absolutely. I think that's really important. Culture is important. I have the luxury of having only 36 people where I do know their names. I do know their cats' names, their children's names. I have personal relationships with almost all of my employees, which for the most part is a great thing for culture. Sometimes gets a little bit confusing and conflicting, but it's a family business. So that has been sort of a theme from the very beginning of this is a family, Alchemist Labs. We care about what we do. We believe that there's a purpose in what we do. And I say to my staff, look, I want you to test like you're testing because the product you're testing is going to go in the stomach of your children or my children. That's what we do here. We provide quality control for companies making products, but it's more than that. We try to pretend like those products are going to go on our most important people's bodies. And it gives us this purpose that I don't think exists with big one-stop shop labs in these massive conglomerates that currently exist as competitors.
And one thing I thought was intriguing that not only you're running this, but you still enjoy using the microscope. And even though you have these papers on analytical chemistry techniques out there, you still will preach to people that you can get a lot of identification and work done with a simple microscope. Can you talk more about how you teach people about that?
Right. So we believe in fit for purpose. You don't need a sledgehammer to drive a nail into a piece of wood. And funny enough, some of the technologies that we pioneer are old. They're the very oldest. I mean, the first oldest is organoleptic, looking at something with your eyes, tasting with your tongue, smelling with your nose. Second would be looking at it under the microscope. My mother was a microbiologist, so I grew up with a microscope in our house. When I was a kid, I would put everything under the scope, boogers, snails, ants, whatever. So we still have that same scope that I grew up with in our lab. We have a second one, of course, a newer and better version. I've always been fascinated with microscopy, looking deeper and deeper into things beyond what the naked eye can see. And that same philosophy exists in the culture of alchemists, is just not being satisfied at the surface level. Microscopy is a fantastic and very effective tool, to identify raw materials. It's actually uncovered things that the other higher end technologies have not been able to see. It's just an oldie and a goodie. We also use HPTLC, which is also a technology that's nearly 100 years old. And then, of course, HPLC and MS and so on and so forth. But there are certain technologies that work really well for this industry. And, DNA has showed up to make an appearance. It's been determined that it's not so fit for purpose. It can't tell plant parts from each other. And by law, you're required to be able to say this is ginseng root as opposed to ginseng leaf. And the fanciest of DNA techniques cannot do that at this time. So it's pleasing to me that we use these old antique technologies that are still fantastically effective.
And could you, if you had a customer coming to you to ask about what HTPLC is and GC and some of your other techniques, how do you describe those to them?
So, as I said, I majored in botany, switched to business, then finished with chemistry. I should have stayed in business and I would have graduated a lot sooner. Chemistry was very challenging for me. And what I learned early on is that I'm just going to get through this and I'll hire the smartest chemists rather than trying to be one. That gave me the ability to talk to the regular people about chemistry. And so when I give a lab tour, I give these really wonderful explanations of HPLC and HPTLC. Those two technologies are essentially separation science. You take a sample, you separate the individual components, you take that liquid or material and apply it to a detector, and it essentially gives you some sort of data. I use the example as if you're at a party and you're trying to get across the party to, say, the booze or the shrimp or whatever it might be. And if you're there with your biggest linebacker friend, you might be able to shimmy through the crowd, whereas your linebacker friend won't be able to shimmy through the crowd so easily. So you might enter the booze line faster than they will, unless they use force. And there's different types of chromatography. There's size exclusion and there's chemistry. And what we do essentially is that same thing. We elute small chemicals through chemistry columns and detect their amplitude or fingerprint. So just as examples, I can essentially make it understandable by the basic folk all the way through the PhD chemistry experts in our industry.
Well, that's pretty great. I've never heard it described as a buffet line with a football linebacker.
It works.
So
it does work.
I'm impressed.
Yeah.
For years, I've been writing about cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. I gathered people's stories from around the world. I learned about the long human history with hemp, and I interviewed scientists about the importance of our own cannabinoids. But at the time, the positive effects of CBD were only starting to dawn on me. It took me seeing the impact that CBD-rich hemp extracts made on the health of my cousin, and the comfort it gave to some of my elderly relatives, especially the ones who are always against pot. Since then, the many stories I've heard from people using CBD made me a believer in its potential. That makes me proud to now be working at CV Sciences, because I know firsthand how hard they work to produce the finest quality CBD-rich hemp supplements. I'm proud because I know we lead the industry in research and education, proud because I know we make excellent CBD oil from true agricultural hemp, and I'm most proud because I know our products make a difference in people's lives. At pluscbdoil.com, use a coupon code Lex Files for 20% off to see for yourself. And one of the other things you have there that seems like it would be very helpful is your composite reference botanicals that you produce. Can you tell us what those are and how they're useful to customers?
Yeah, so we're a laboratory. There are other labs. Our biggest competitor is actually when our customers decide to internalize the testing. So at some point in time, the CFO of our customers wake up and they say, we should do that ourselves. So we can either lose the customer or we can guide them slowly out. And so what we do is we sell something called a composite reference botanical. Essentially, if you're going to test for oranges, you have to have reference oranges to test all of your incoming unknowns against. And we provide essentially those oranges along with a method for botanical microscopy and a method for HPTLC. What we do that's different from the other labs and the other the reference materials providers is we provide a composite. So I use the example of a peach. A peach out of season is still a peach. Right now it's no longer peach season. But the fact is the big box stores will still sell peaches all year round. And they, as you know, if you go to a farmer's market in the dead of summer, The peaches taste very different than the peaches that are sold in October. But the fact is, they're still peaches, genetically still peaches. Chemically, the flavor profile that you're tasting with your tongue doesn't match so well, but it still resembles a peach. So the point I'm making, though, is that if all of your reference materials are of one selection, so N, statistically N of one, you're doing yourself a disservice by comparing all incoming materials to the same out-of-season peach. What we sell is a composite reference botanical. So it's essentially 4 different lots of material from around the world, different sources. We verify each and every one of them, and then we combine them. And what you get is a combination of 3 or 4 different lots of material from different origins of the world, which gives you a better representation of what the industry is also moving around and testing. So you essentially have a statistical average of 4 instead of 1, and you can better pass or better fail materials.
That does seem like a really helpful thing for people, because you maintain a number of reference standards as well that are needed in this kind of testing.
Correct. We have an on-site herbarium with nearly 20,000 specimens that we've been collecting for the 23 years we've been in business. So when we get a sample of Bacopa monieri, we don't test it against 1 or 4. We test it against 4 that each have been tested against 4 and 4 and 4 and 4 and so on and so forth. So it's like a fractal of data, millions and millions of data points. We know what each and every one of these botanicals should look like chromatographically and why. And when something shows up, like an extra band or a missing band, we can go back to our archives and see when we've seen that in the past. Sometimes we can say, oh, this material came from France and the other material came from France, and that maybe there's something happening there. Or it could be a drought, or it could be a rainy season, or it could have been dried too hot or not dried enough. All of these little variables play a role in what the final product is like. And if you're going to judge them all against one specimen, you're doing a statistical disservice.
And now just take it to the higher level, because you're involved in a lot of industry groups like AHPA. And you actually also, congratulations on winning the Nutra Champion at the Nutra Ingredients Award.
Thank you.
Yeah,
that was quite an honor.
Yeah. To people out there listening, they only give that to 2 people. It's not one of these awards that they give out trade shows where a couple hundred, people
Right.
or products get this. Only 2 people got it, and he was one of them. And it's in some of your quotes that are a little bit more poking of different industries. You asserted that cannabis is more heavily regulated than the dietary supplement industry.
I've been watching cannabis for a long time. I was the original chair of the American Herbal Products Association Committee for Cannabis. Based on a personal experience that I had, where a material was much stronger than it was supposed to be, which to me gave put light upon the fact that that industry needed assistance. The cannabis industry has grown up at first unregulated, but in California, the Bureau of Cannabis Control has enormous regulations that usurp the current federal regs for echinacea and ginkgo. And I think our industry, meaning the dietary supplement industry, can learn a lot from the very, very strict regulations that we see in cannabis in California. One example is that a purveyor of material can't test it themselves. So there's a reduced chance of collusion or corruption. It has to be tested by a third-party lab. The other thing I like to point out is that the consumers expect to see lab results, and the brands do nothing but brag about the labs and the lab results they use and they get. Whereas in the dietary supplement industry, there's for some reason some sort of proprietary aspect to lab testing, lab results. In cannabis, that's one of their leading value propositions is lab tested. Here's the results. Here's how you know it's going to be, effective and safe from metals, pesticides, and microbiological toxins. So I've been saying for the last several years that this industry can take a look at cannabis and learn a little bit about how they are essentially servicing the consumers, giving them the full transparency, essentially from seed to shelf, which has been a phrase used in our industry, but very poorly shown. There's a few companies in our industry. Gaia Herbs is one that shows the data. They have a whole program called Meet Your Herbs, and we can type in a lot number from the bottle on the web, and you can get lab results. You can get data on the farm and how it was grown. I believe this is the next generation of transparency that the consumers who are going to eventually pay our bills are requiring and requesting.
And that speaks to something that you also said before, as you've watched from your vantage point, you've seen the herb companies being run by herbalists when you first started, by and large, and now you see a lot more marketing companies selling herbs.
Absolutely.
What's that been like for you?
It's a major challenge. Like you said, a lot of our first clientele were herbalists, started herbalist founded companies. And then, as they get bigger, we all kind of reach our greatest incompetency before we realize someone else should take over this legacy. And a lot of companies have brought in, either private equity or just, execs from other industries who know how to run companies from X millions to Y millions. That always changes things. A lot of the founders have remained in the background doing formulas, but as far as how the businesses are run, they're run like businesses rather than passionate herb shops. I can't say that it's bad, it's just different. Marketing has a big play in this. There's something we call the Dr. Oz effect. So if Dr. Oz says raspberry ketones are important, everyone rushes to the stores, buys raspberry ketones, everyone rushes to the market and tries to provide raspberry ketones in their products, whether they're good or bad or necessary or of high quality. So we have to catch up sometimes to some of these trends. We're generally pretty aware of what's going on in the industry and perhaps even ahead of the game. But marketing is definitely a driver in this industry. What they feel the consumers want is what ultimately produces the formulas in this industry. Whereas you go back 20 years and beyond, it was definitely, the formulas were created based upon the need of the patient in a clinical herbal setting. Again, not bad, not good, just different. And like evolution, if you're not adapting to the surroundings, you'll essentially phase out.
Speaking of changes as you've watched things mature, can you tell us about what it was like to watch Desha come into power for the first time, and what it is, and why you're now calling for a Desha 2.0?
Actually, Desha was a little bit before the lab. So I think I've been published saying if Desha would be essentially our grandfather, and our father would be GMPs, and then Alchemist was a spawn of the GMPs. So I really had no consciousness of Desha. We started the lab without regard to even if that was a thing. A few years in, Lauren Iselson, one of the grandfathers of Desha, the writers of Desha, showed up at our lab. He's now the executive director, CEO of UNPA, a wonderful human in this industry, and again, a good friend. He essentially showed up at our lab around 99 and said, "You guys are in a good place at a good time, and hang in there and keep doing it." We owe everything to Lauren and Desha. Without his work and Desha's rules, GMPs would not have come out, and the rules that regulate this industry would not have come out, which are critically important to the health and safety and effectiveness of this industry.
And so how would you like to see Desha updated now for this internet marketing era?
Yeah, so, Desha, I tell people Desha was written back when fax machines were a thing, and I had a Palm Trio. So a lot has changed. As you mentioned, the internet marketing phase of this industry. I think Desha is a wonderful foundation, and I think it's time to add some things. I can't think of anything I would remove. What I would do if I had a magic wand here, is I would have the FDA specify which methods are suitable for which types of tests. For example, the FDA in their current GMPs used the phrase, just use something scientifically valid. And in turn, there's been a number of, I'll call them magic boxes, whether they're bouncing some light across a sample and bouncing that data across a library that's not internal, or now there's even cell phone apps that are taking pictures of materials, and that's allegedly adequate to identify material. I call BS on those things. There's science technology that has been around and useful for many, many years, and it's about time that the new rules, should it be Desha 2.0 or 25.0, it's about time that they come out and say, for this type of test, use this technology, period, the end. I can't think of any reason why they wouldn't, because it's really a disservice to the industry. There's a lot of internal labs using inferior technologies, magic boxes, so to speak, that don't do a good job at identifying materials or even adulterants. The other thing I would do is this product registration. All other countries do this. All other mainstream countries do this. If you want to sell a product, you register with the FDA or whoever is equivalent. There are reasons why we could argue against it, and those are the same reasons that would essentially protect small companies from adhering to regulations that help make us safe. I kind of feel bad for them because I am a small company and I've been a very small company before, and I understand how hard it is to keep up with the big companies. But the fact is, this is the time, this is where we are, and it is necessary to register products. This would help us weed out some of the bad products. If you're not registered, there's a reason. Or if you are registered, we now have essentially a list of the things people are trying to sell, and we can essentially look at that list and take off the bad ones that ultimately are plaguing this industry, giving us a bad reputation, perpetuating the snake oil phrase in this industry. So those are the two main things I would do. I would specify methods, and I would enforce a product registration. This is, of course, coming from the lab standpoint. I'm sure there's a ton of other things that manufacturers and brokers might feel necessary to add as well.
And so for the last question, I was just curious, what are you excited for in the future of your own company and then also for the industry as well?
Alchemist Labs has been testing plants for, like I said, 23 years. We stayed focused on what we're good at. A lot of the other tests are commodity tests. In the last few years, there's been a few labs that have been gobbling up all the other labs, and now there's essentially one or two big labs left and a few tiny little ones. I always say Alchemist is one of the biggest little labs left, and what we do is unique and boutique. But the fact is, I have nothing against Walmart, but a lot of people don't want to go to Walmart. They want to go to Whole Foods for their meat, Trader Joe's for their nuts and dried snacks and whatever. And the same thing goes to labs. There's fewer and fewer lab choices out there, and our customers are essentially coming to us and saying, Elan, we need you to test more than what you offer because we don't want to use the big labs. They've just bought another big lab. They're discombobulated. The service is terrible. There's no personal touch. There's no soul, and they don't get to give the CEO a hug, and I'm a hugging CEO. So in the future for us, we are expanding where our plans are to offer metals testing, microbiological testing, pesticides testing. We plan to bring on some NMR so we can do synthetic versus non-synthetic, and as well as stability chambers. So I'm super excited to further service the dietary supplement industry for which we've been serving for many, many years. The great thing about that expansion is it also fully services hemp. We've been very careful and risk averse about the testing we do for which industry. And so we've opened up the door to hemp testing, CBD and friends, and THC limit testing and all that. But that industry is different from the dietary supplement industry, where they've been used to the one-stop shop labs. That's all they've known, essentially the pot labs that exist and only test cannabis, and they do all the tests. Where, like I said, we test 2,000 plants, but we only really do identity and strength testing. So by tooling up for the dietary supplement industry, we're also tooling up for the hemp industry, ready to go, fully support the hemp companies. By tooling up for the hemp industry, we're also ready to fully support the cannabis industry. And the city of Stanton, where the lab exists, has indicated to us that they are interested in opening up the rules and regulations to cannabis, and they want a lab in the city to test the cannabis. So we actually have local government eager for us to jump and support the cannabis industry, which is a completely different industry, regulated completely different, but ultimately one plant extra. Whether it's a new species of lavender or cannabis, it doesn't really matter to us. As far as the equipment and the tests go, they're not much different. There are, of course, rules that we have to abide by to test legal medicinal or recreational cannabis. But I'm very excited to finally jump into that game and provide that industry a well-needed legacy lab that's been testing plants for over 20 years, and not a company who started just a few years ago and tests one plant and has been doing so on their own with very, very little oversight. Alchemist is a brand known all over the world, and I believe very strongly that that industry, the cannabis industry, the hemp industry, is just waiting for us to offer the services to support them.
Well, that's great. It's an exciting future.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to share with us, and best of luck moving forward. Hopefully we can talk again as more updates come out.
My pleasure. It's been wonderful. Thank you, Lex.
Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, find us at pluscbdoil.com/Lex Files. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com. If you enjoyed the program, please rate us on iTunes and share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. Our chief advisor is Amabel Dela Cruz. The music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. Our sponsor is CV Sciences, maker of America's favorite CBD oil. And remember the coupon code Lex Files. I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.